Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Benjamin Sear, and this is a joint work between myself, and my peer Yan Long at the University of Michigan, Takashi Sugawara, who is at the University of Electrocommunications in Tokyo, and Kevin Fu, who is now at Northeastern University. And today I'm here to talk about something a little bit different than most of the threat models here. We're going to be looking at satellite sensor spoofing. And this is a position paper, so the idea here is not necessarily to provide answers to all the questions or anything, but rather to raise questions to sort of inspire future research directions. So, where's the clicker?
Like 1 minute, okay? Yeah.
All right, so a little bit about myself. I have been interested in space for a long time. I was, in my undergrad, I was part of the Auburn University Small Satellite Program and did a lot of work with developing an electrical power system, as well as a little bit of work in an attitude determination and control system for a 6U CubeSat. But more recently, in the past 5 years, I've been a lot more looking at cyber physical security of sensors. So looking at different ways, especially looking at lasers and ways that lasers can interact with sensors in strange and sort of unexpected ways. And probably the main claim to fame there is our work Light Commands, where we fired a laser signal at a MEMS microphone in order to induce a signal that was able to affect the system. And the key thing being here that it was a very unexpected way to influence the sensor. And as I was moving on and thinking about new areas to look at, I was trying to combine that with my previous research in space, security in space, to sort of think of what threat models might exist. So obviously, and a lot of the talks here today are going to be talking about communications. Obviously, communication is a very high priority within the context of space security. This is the primary input, and it's inherently sensitive towards outside signals. But I'm here to talk today about mostly other inputs, mainly sensors, and different ways, that you have cameras, you have, to some extent you can call solar cells a sensor, or different ADAC sensors that are used to determine the attitude of the satellite. And all of these are also inputs to the system that could potentially be exploited. So there are some research into this. So primarily the way to actually influence these sensors that's been investigated before is laser-based attacks in space. And that's all mainly because light is a very efficient way to transfer energy through the vacuum of space in high density. But pretty much all of the previous research has been focused on sensor data availability, right? Ways to prevent jamming or damaging of these sensors. And of course, there are different threat models looking at ground to space, air to space, space to space, different ways that lasers might be used in this way to affect a satellite. But what about our sensor data integrity? That's the main thing that we want to bring up. We've found sort of a gap in the research when it comes to the threat modeling, where, and we believe that threat models should start considering sensor integrity. There's very little research on how this applies to space, but the idea being that these sort of attacks are inherently more stealthy, as the spoofing is a lot more difficult to detect as you're starting to change the signals within the sensors. And that sort of leads us to four key questions to be answered. What components are most vulnerable in these systems? What capabilities are required to do sensor spoofing? And what are the consequences of these attacks? And ultimately, what should be done to protect space sensors? So just so that we're all on the same page, absolute trust, as a lot of our research has shown, absolute trust in sensors tends to lead to vulnerabilities. Whenever you have some sort of control loop, ultimately your feedback is dependent on the sensors. And if an adversary can add in some adversarial signal towards your sensors, that signal will cascade down and potentially start changing the system state itself. And there's been a lot of research recently that has been investigating this. Pretty obviously, there's been a lot of laser attacks on optical sensors. So in using lasers to exploit cameras, rolling shutters within cameras in order to start to fool computer vision systems. And of course, different attacks on LiDAR systems. That is pretty common in the vehicle sec workshop. But on top of that, more recently, there's been this interest in these sensors that weren't expected to be affected by light, and primarily the microphones that we were doing, and also some work in MEMS pressure sensors. All right. So the idea of this work is just to lay out, what might be possible. What questions exist, what might be possible within the space of space. So first, we wanted to try and, as a start, just start defining an attack surface. What components are most vulnerable? And we started listing out potential sensors that exist on various satellites, from cameras that are often a payload of the device, or the solar panels, which are going to be inherently sensitive to incoming light, but even or the different ways to detect your attitude via either sun sensors or different star trackers or horizon trackers. And we were looking at different ways that light might start influencing these and cause false data towards the system. And that even extends, as we showed before, there are different weird ways you can interact with sensors that aren't expected. And we were wondering if, we have questions and interest in seeing if some of the other sensors that not even optical sensors might be considered within some of these threat models. So just as an example, as one of the simplest examples, so a sun sensor itself is mainly just a photodiode that often just detects the direction of a strong light source. And most of these systems are built with the assumption that, hey, this strong light source must be the sun, and therefore I can use that as a vector to determine my orientation in space. But any strong incoming laser signal would potentially shift this sun vector and change the perceived attitude of the system. And a controller will attempt to compensate, which has unknown consequences, as far as whatever the system is doing. It might reduce the performance of what's going on, waste energy, and maybe there are ways that it could actually damage a sensitive component in a stealthy way that wasn't expected. So in the paper, we talk about the different potential components that might be vulnerable, but also what we wanted to bring up was some questions on what capabilities would be required to do this sensor spoofing. When we laid out some of the factors that we were thinking of, as far as like power, what are the limits in generating laser power? And there's been a lot of research and a lot of interest from various different groups to try and develop high power laser technology. And you're starting to see more and more of these 10 kilowatt, 100 kilowatt, or even megawatt class lasers being developed for various reasons. And that's one of the capabilities that needs to be accounted for in sort of these spoofing attacks. Next, timing and modulation. Of course, you can't just have straight power. Often, most of these sensor attacks are reliant on some sort of modulation and firing with some sort of pattern in a way to fool the sensor that you're attacking. What sort of modulation schemes would be necessary for these sensors, and that also ties directly into the technology of the laser itself and how often you can fire and what sort of, as many of the high power lasers are pulsed with certain rates that are limited to. And of course, as mentioned before, angles and aiming is a significant factor that goes into any sort of sensor attack in order to make sure you are lining up a laser in the right way and have the beam spread that could, with enough irradiance and beam, aiming to hit what you're trying to hit. And of course, tracking as far as that goes. Some of the other capabilities we're thinking of course, is, range. Every single laser is going to spread, reducing its power density over distance. And, what sort of capabilities would various different laser technologies have given various beam sizes, what wavelengths that they're using, the beam quality of what's being fired. What are the limits of what is necessary to get the range that is required at the very large distances of space. And, another one, atmospheric disturbances. If you're talking about a ground to space situation, you're going to have to handle all the different problems with atmosphere, of attenuation, scintillation, as your beam is being randomized and ultimately beam wander as the beam is being bent by the changes in the atmosphere. So all this is going towards, all these questions are trying to determine what moving on towards the consequences of these attacks. So if these sensor attacks can be pulled off, what does this mean for the system? Is it going to be a reduction in the performance of the system? Is it going to be just a very temporary annoyance? But can you cause some sort of permanent damage or mission failure in a stealthy way that's not really expected? And ultimately, another question is which satellite types are most vulnerable. As the trends have gone on in satellites, they've been getting smaller and smaller and cheaper, closer towards Earth. It's important to know if certain satellites are a lot more vulnerable towards these attacks. So all of this, again, is just to highlight some future directions in research. I'm not saying that any of these sensor attacks are a main concern right now or a primary concern of security in space, but it is something that could potentially be in the future. And we're hoping to sort of inspire some research and different areas into these directions in order to ultimately, solve this last question of how should space sensors be protected in the future. So thank you for letting me talk a little bit about this, and I'm open to any questions or discussion. So
thank you. Questions from the audience? Besides Knut?
Hi, Tim Ellis, SRI International. Thank you. It's an interesting talk. It brings a question into my mind or a thought when we're thinking about things like spoofing or confusing the satellites. Usually they're going through something that would sort of throw them off, confuse them in a big way. But it would seem that in most of the control loops and things that they would have, they'd have some kind of a Kalman filter or something embedded into it that would be looking for the worst sensor or the most noisy and start to de-weight that. One of the things I've been thinking of, and I'm wondering if you've gone down this path, is sort of the idea of, instead of a large perturbation, a small drift, a small imperceptible drift that's sort of built over time and wouldn't be picked up by some of these kinds of control and correction kinds of mechanisms. Is that something that's within the realm of the laser kind of thing that you're talking about here?
Yeah.
Obviously the point there is what would you do about it to prevent that?
Yeah, of course. So that is a very interesting question. I've actually seen some work that is trying to defend against some of these sensor attacks that involve, hey, let's keep track of our system state, and if there's a huge sudden change, then obviously there's some anomaly that's going on. And the only way to counter that is starting to have these slow changes over time. And that's actually a very difficult problem to overcome and a very relevant question towards defenses of these things. I'd like to highlight, though, that often these systems are made, as you said, with Kalman filtering and so on, with this idea of trying to promote reliability. And again, that goes into a little bit of James's talk as far as the difference between safety and reliability versus security. And this difference between, preparing for random noise or something to fail versus an adversary who has some sort of intelligence who can try and overcome whatever protections are in place. But yeah, you have it is going to be a very challenging attack to do a very slow change over time, but that is something that is going to be needed for future research. Yeah.
Yes, very interesting. Thanks a lot. I think, as a general comment, or also question to James, if he's still listening, one thing that I think will come a lot and will in the future, which will make also this kind of work a lot more relevant, is so-called robotic service missions. So this is a new service trend, that you have a small robotic spacecraft that approaches another satellite and maybe even grabs it, either to deorbit it in terms of cleanup, or to prolong its service life or to refuel it. So that means proximity operations will come. And that also means that it could be RF based, it could be using a very small laser. And also we may need new sensors to defend against this. So a satellite must become much more aware that is actually being targeted. And just to follow up also, due to the safety, most of the sensors are redundant. Some are even triplicated. So how would you deal with that? And I think there's sensors like, for example, thermistors, which I think wouldn't need any modulation to spoof. If you heat the thermistors up, then you could cause a payload shutdown, so like a denial of service.
Yeah, so that's definitely, in our paper, we also consider various temperature sensors, as the thermal system itself is its own system, right? As far as how to handle, redundant sensors, that's a problem in any sort of, in anything where you have sensor fusion, trying to decide, hey, I have multiple sensors that are giving you different information, which one do I trust? That is a defense towards any of these sensor spoofing problems. But depending on the capabilities of an attacker, it's hard to say whether maybe the attacker could affect multiple sensors in a certain way. But having it coordinate is definitely going to be a difficult problem and something that's going to require future work in directions. So,
last question.
Yeah. So we've done some various work thinking about secure satellite systems and the like, and stumbled across this problem and really struggled with it for a while, not really sure, like, other than sensor fusion, what you attempt to do to combat this. Do you have any insights or any, and maybe anything from the audio sensor work that you did that, might start pointing people in possibly promising directions?
Yeah, so there is a lot of new work being developed towards defenses towards these sensor spoofing attacks. Like I mentioned a bit earlier, I think some of the more promising ones are ones that basically increase the difficulty of the sensor spoofing attack by keeping track of the system state a lot more effectively and trying to prevent, trying to recognize anomalies in strange ways. You also have, but yeah, it's a difficult problem that's being researched in a lot of different ways. I know, even in VehicleSec, I think the keynote itself was talking about how do we handle that for, vehicles and autonomous vehicles. But yeah, it's definitely a difficult problem. Some of the other things, rather than maybe a system level defense, you could even start looking at sensor level defenses. Different ways you might be able to, if you take into account certain threat models, maybe there are different ways you can add different mechanisms to the sensor, physical or not. Like a lot of my research recently has been looking at MEMS microphones. Is there ways you can change the design of the sensor so that it is less susceptible towards a light commands attack? And I think that's important to look at as well.